These hills are home to endangered gorillas. The Kahuzi Biega National Park is a UNESCO World Heritage Site funded with public German money. It's a magnet for tourists, even though it's tucked away in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo. But the park is also home to these villagers, the Batwa people. They've allegedly suffered killings, rapes, and the burning of their homes. These photos document what looks like a systematic terror campaign. The aim? To drive them out of the park, they tell us. A rights group says this persecution is indirectly financed by the German government. Last November, the village was attacked and the Batwa left. They've been scratching a living in this abandoned construction site since then. Kibibi Kaloba told us just one of many gruesome stories we heard. She was working in her field when she heard there was an attack. She ran home as fast as she could.
I found that my house was already burned. There was only smoke coming out from where the house was. I took a stick to pass it through the ashes. I saw the head of one of my children in it.
She took her other children and fled, away from the village, but haunted by what she found in the wreckage. The door had been tied shut. Those who burned her house must have locked her 4-year-old and her 5-year-old inside. Witnesses say the attackers were park guards and Congolese soldiers. They say park management wants to keep the Batwa people out, even though it includes their ancestral land.
They were sent by the Wildlife Authority. Every year since 2019, they've come to attack us. When they killed people, they cut off their arms and showed them to others, telling them to leave the fields, or they would exterminate them all.
The construction site is squalid. There's no clean water or medical help. It's not even safe. There was a violent attack by an armed group a few days before we arrived. The NGO Minority Rights Group has extensively researched the violent incidents in the last 3 years. In their latest report, they say park guards have killed at least 20 unarmed civilians, gang-raped 15 women, and forced hundreds to flee. We found 2 park guards who admitted being actively involved in multiple attacks. They would only talk anonymously. They said a colleague who had spoken before had been found dead.
I was there. They already built their villages 3 times and we destroyed them. They started in 2019. We burned the houses that were there, but they still rebuilt.
Usually they carry out attacks with soldiers from the Congolese army, he says. But he was clear, their orders came directly from the park director, De-Dieu Bya'Ombe.
We left together, mixed with our brothers of the National Army, and the order came from our leader, De-Dieu Bya'Ombe. We were 75 people. Our mission was to go and burn these houses, and whoever tries to play around, if you have to kill them, you kill them.
The aim is to terrorize the villagers so badly that they don't return, he says. They use machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades and mortars in the attacks, he says. Both deny having committed or witnessed any cases of rape. Back in the park, the Batwa have decided to return to their village, even if it's risky. Kibibi Kaloba will fix her house, try to rebuild her life. The Batwa say they'll stay here, no matter what. If people come to kill them, at least they'll die on their land.
The Minority Rights Group report also found that park authorities continue to receive funding from foreign governments like the US and Germany, as well as conservation groups, despite being made aware of the atrocities since 2019. Now, we put these allegations to the relevant authorities. The National Park Director, De-Dieu Bya'Ombe, wrote to DW saying there had never been any targeted violence in the park and that he had never ordered such attacks. He said he was a victim of a conspiracy to get rid of him as park director. And Germany's Ministry of Development is calling for an independent investigation. It released this statement saying, "We take these allegations very seriously. If they are correct, there will be consequences, including Germany's support of the national park." For more on this, I'm joined by Robert Flummerfeld. He's the author of the minority rights group report that looks into the allegations of violence against the Batwa people in the DRC. Thank you very much indeed for being with us here on DW News Africa. Are you satisfied with the response from the parties that have been responsible for helping conserve this park?
Well, it's important to note that although it's good that the German government in particular has expressed grave concern at what we've addressed, the German government was notified. All of the agencies involved in supporting the park were notified repeatedly, beginning in 2019, of the campaign that has been conducted organizing members of this indigenous community, the Batwa. The response when those agencies in the German government were notified, in particular GIZ, KfW, was less concerned when such notifications were not public. As an example, after a particularly gruesome attack in July of last year, when GIZ received a specific notification of the details of the fact that several villages had been entirely destroyed, people killed execution style, targeted with heavy weapons, a staffer from GIZ went with the German ambassador to the park, not to investigate, but actually to organize a PR stunt, to smile next to park guards, according to the press spokesperson, to congratulate the park guards on their mission and on their hard work, and to promise to try to convince German tourists, reluctant German tourists, to come to the park. So although now there's a lot of concern, that concern hasn't been there for the last 3 years when there were multiple notifications of about this violence. Yeah.
So with this specific investigation, can you just talk us through how you were able to conduct it and gain access to these specific cases?
Yeah. It's important to note that although we did talk to hundreds of eyewitness sources, some of the strongest evidence that we were able to gather was actually physical evidence. That's to say, we visited these villages days after their destruction while they're literally still smoldering, while there's still literally articles of blood-stained clothing drying in the sun, visited the freshly dug graves, recovered shell casings from weapons that were used consistent with the accounts of eyewitnesses, AK-47 rounds from belt-fed machine guns, boxes even from heavy weapons used, 60-millimeter mortars, RPGs as well. So in addition to hundreds of eyewitness sources, we also gathered a preponderance of physical evidence and additionally spoke to park guards who participated in the violence and described quite glibly having a crisis of conscience about the fact that they were engaged in these sorts of attacks aimed at expelling an indigenous community from their ancestral lands. Yeah.
So we have an idea of who is conducting the attacks, first-hand accounts. But who's authorizing them? And what's the motive?
Well, there's no question that the orders came directly from park leadership. These are not, bad apples, park guards deciding to engage in horrific attacks on their own initiative. This was an institutional policy to expel indigenous people from a park that sits on their ancestral lands. It was sanctioned at the highest level by park authorities, and incidentally, although of course all of the international supporters of the park would say they had no hand in this, they did indeed provide substantial military-style support, the provision of support for training, military-style training, combat techniques, weapons handling for the park guards, as well as non-lethal military equipment, as well as bankrolling the entire operation, the entire time, despite being notified of the fact that this campaign was ongoing with the intention of expelling Batwa from their land. Yeah.
So this concept of militarized conservation, does that require an element of policy reform in order to hold those accountable going forward?
I would say that, on the whole, this is a rigidly neo-colonial, violent mode of protecting wildlife. Some people call it the fortress model. That's to say, creating militarized fortresses where, the only people, that are allowed to visit are sort of foreign tourists who can come and visit, or foreign conservationist experts, and everybody else, in particular marginalized communities, are denied access to the land. And if they try to enter, the best case is that they're arrested. Worst case is that they're subjected to sort of tremendous brutality. I think there's no question that this approach to conservation is not only fundamentally unjust, but it actually doesn't work. It pits communities against the notion of conservation, and additionally, in different places where it's tried, it simply doesn't work. You have increasing and accelerating biodiversity loss. So not only is it unjust, but it's also a sort of dysfunctional approach. Absolutely needs reform, yes.
And just very quickly, if you could just break down what are the responsibilities under the laws in the DRC to protect indigenous communities there?
The DRC is a signatory to the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which acknowledges the right of indigenous people to access their ancestral lands. Now, that, of course, flies in the face of, the sort of history of the Batwa, who were originally expelled from the park in the mid-1970s, and then upon returning in 2018, were subjected to the sorts of organized violence that we documented in our report. So, although DRC is a signatory to that law, obviously, the way in which the government and the supporters have behaved in the PNKB has been strictly inconsistent with the recognition of that right enshrined in the UNDRIP, yeah.
Okay, Robert Blumenfeld, thank you very much indeed for speaking to DW News Africa.
Thank you so much. Thank you.